Morris Berman, he's author of Why America Failed, The Roots of Imperial Decline. Morris, welcome to the Young Turks.
Hi, how are you?
Lovely, and great to have you here. So I think that a lot of people might think, has it already failed? Have we already gotten there?
Well, that's why I put it in the past tense. You know, this book, Why America Failed, is the third in a series of three. It was a trilogy.
Right. The one before this was The Return of the King, right?
Very good, very good. It started out actually with a book called The Twilight of American Culture. And then a few years ago, the second was Dark Ages America. And this one is Why America Failed is basically a post-mortem. In other words, the data for America having failed and the experiment being over, those data are extremely good. I mean, I've got piles of folders, you know. And so
but
this
Morris, don't give me the pile, but tell us, I mean, summarize for us, if you can,
sure,
why you think America has already failed. What's your evidence to that effect?
Oh, sure, sure. One thing I would say is that if you take every institution in the United States, whether it's the Supreme Court or it's the school system or the military, what you'll find is that every one of those institutions is corrupt down to the core. And there have been many books on in the case of each institution, or articles or whatever. For example, I mentioned the Supreme Court. A few months ago, Ronald Dworkin, who's one of America's leading intellectuals, did an essay in the New York Review of Books. And what he said was, and this is a very sober kind of guy, you got to understand, he's not a hothead like me, you know. He said, well, if you look at the Supreme Court, it's actually become a court of men and not of laws. In the case of 5 out of 9 justices, he says, the decisions are made in advance in a right-wing political direction. And then what they do is they come up, after they make their decision, they come up with the justification for the decision after the fact, even though that decision often violates the Constitution. So what are we talking about here? The Supreme Court is a sham. Now, for me to say it is one thing. For Dworkin, who's a constitutional expert and an expert in jurisprudence, that's a whole different thing.
I understand that, but Morris, just because that is the case, and we're really not going to get an argument from us on that, how does that translate into America has therefore failed?
Well, what I'm saying is that in the case of each of these institutions, I said I got piles of folders, we could go through the educational system. Everybody agrees that's a failure. We could go through every single institution. What you'll find usually is that they don't say it's a failure. What they say at the end is, here's how to repair it. Because that's obligatory in the United States. At the end, in the 11th hour, you've got to pull a rabbit out of a hat and say, if we do X, Y, and Z, everything's going to be fine, but we got to do it. What none of these books do is to link all these things together. In other words, to show that it's the same failure across the board, and these institutions are connected by a thread that pulls them all together.
All right, so Morris, but tell me what that thread is. What do you think is the similarity in all of these?
Yes, I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
But once you do that, then it becomes clear that it's impossible to reverse this situation, because where would you start? The thread that I talk about in Why America Failed is that from the very beginning, this was a culture defined by hustling. That is to say, there was always an opportunist element that was very strong. In fact, it took over everything. This is not just Ronald Reagan's greed. I'm not talking about 1981. I'm talking about 1584. That from the very first settlement of this continent, there was the notion that what we're here to do is clean up and get as much as we can and generally get ahead of the other guy.
But Morris, I would argue that that's human nature, don't you think? I mean,
no, not at all. Not
really?
at all. I would argue that it's not human nature at all. In fact, for most of for most of world history, cultures have been what we call steady state. They weren't expanding economies at all, and there was always the presence of making money or getting ahead and so on as a factor, but you never had a situation in traditional societies where that was the dominant culture. The
really?
United States...
I mean, so for example, the Mongols, they were in favor of expansion. and they seemed to do it in a way that was not very friendly to their neighbors.
Right. Well, war goes back a long time. You know, war goes back a long time. I'm not sure that defined Mongol society. What I'm talking about is an everyday way of life, that constituted a hustling mentality. And the United States is very different. It's really unique in the panoply, if you will, of all other world cultures, because it had no feudal history. It was born bourgeois. And so the impulse, going back 400 years, is that that life is about economic expansion. Once you do that, there finally are limits to how long you can play that game. We have hit those limits. We hit them in 1929. It's just that what Franklin Roosevelt did was, a very smart guy, what he really wanted to do was save capitalism. And he was very successful. So you throw a few crumbs, you know, Social Security, this and that, Work Progress Administration. You throw a few crumbs to the working and the middle class, and then everything calms down, and basically the system pretty much goes on as it was before. It's just with some restraint and modification.
Let's talk for a minute, Morris, about what happens now. You say there are some comparisons to where the United States is now to the fall of the Roman Empire. So is that where we're headed? I mean, what do we do for the next, you mentioned 1929, what do we do for the next 82 years?
Well, it's not a question of, for me, giving prescriptions. It's a question of
no,
saying,
I'm going to rephrase it. What happens for the next 82 years?
Yeah, right. It's a question of saying what's likely to occur. And I think what's likely to occur is that first of all, in terms of the culture coming apart or the fall and so on, it's not like Rome fell on August 4th at 2 in the afternoon, 476 AD.
Right.
It took a long time. It's a process. We are in that process now. You know, when I gave that list of institutions, just look around. Do you think the schools are educating anybody? They're a joke. The military can't win 2 small wars. It's bogged down in 2 small wars, and it can't win them. Yep. What kind of a military is this? And so if you take every institution and you see the failure going on, the collective failure, this is a process. We are in a process of decline now.
You know, Morris, it's really interesting. I'm going to disagree with you. First of all, I like your adage that Rome wasn't built in a day and it wasn't destroyed in a day either. That I'm having fun with. But I would argue that the education system in the United States was fantastic for a great number of decades. You know, you could always look at the things that are going wrong and say, well, you see that, we're in a constant state of decline. But we're just not. In the 1990s, we were not declining, we were rising. And it depends on your perspective. Now, the funny thing is, I agree with you that right now we're in a world of trouble. But I don't think that it had to do with the fact that people are, you know, the country was set up basically on greed, which is, I think, how humanity's set up, and I think we've, you know, channeled it pretty nicely, and I think for some decades we achieved the right balance. I think the problem is that we took that balance away and that greed has run amok, and when that happens, then you have the decline that you're referring to. Well,
first of all, I want to say once again, it is not true that greed is inherent to all societies and that it's been going on since the year dot. That's simply not the case. There have been the record is steady state societies. The historical record is steady state societies, not that greed is the dominant factor. That's easily ascertained. I mean, just read a little history and you'll see it. Then the other thing is the 1990s being an expansion of success. For whom? For whom? It was for this 1% that everybody's talking about down at Zuccotti Park. This expansion that
teen pregnancy was going down. The number of people on the welfare rolls was going down. And so, look, you're not going to get me to disagree that between 1980 and today, we have had this great redistribution of wealth to the top. No question about that. And the 1990s were a part of that. But at the same time, we had some positive movements, 23 million jobs created. This is not an argument for Democrats. I've got no interest in making that argument. I'm just telling you the reality of what happened there. And I remember Ben and I did a news show back then, and every day we were talking about, look at this great news.
Yeah, your reality is incorrect. Because if you look at the stats for rich versus poor during the 1990s, that gap widened. Things got worse for the poor under Clinton. That gap widened. Furthermore, look at the things Clinton did. I mean, not only abolishing welfare, this was a great Republican president, not only abolishing welfare, but basically the whole concept of extraordinary rendition, whereby we send people we want to torture to countries like Morocco or Egypt to do heavy-duty work for us. That was his idea.
Well, let's...
Morris,
this was...
by the way,
this
just a quick note.
It just looked like expansion. It looked like success. This was actually part of the collapse.
No, Morris, I'm not here to argue in favor of Bill Clinton, and I think the deregulation he did at the end of his term, to add to the things that you're mentioning, were deeply problematic, right? And it is part of that same 30-year period where we had issues. I just use it as an example of that we're not constantly declining. The much better example is probably 1940 to 1980, where FDR, you view it as, it appeared to me negatively, I view it as incredibly positive, that he achieved some degree of balance there where we had great prosperity and much better income equality.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And as I said, his job was to save capitalism, and he did by adding restraints to it, and so that was a period of relative prosperity. But you know, what I'm doing here is taking the long view. In other words, for example, Arnold Toynbee, in a study of civilization, says that there are periods when it's in the curve of a civilization, when it starts to decline, there are periods when it rallies, and I would say the post-war period was such a period. There are periods when it rallies, maybe for 20 or 30 years, but the overall curve is one of decline.
So
and that's what I'm talking about, the overall curve.
But then if this is, and I got you, that's interesting. So if this is the overall curve is one of decline, then when was the curve that things were going well? I mean, you're not giving us much of a window where we did well.
The expansion of the United States, again, we have to
because let me just add quickly, and if the standard is some of the things that you've mentioned about the sort of massive economic inequality and our ability to educate, then obviously, and you're saying that FDR threw some crumbs and the post-war period we did have a nice moment. I mean, prior to that, you know, we had women couldn't vote, and blacks couldn't do anything, and zillions of poor children got incredibly crappy educations. When were things awesome?
The business of identity politics is really a way of diverting our attention from that overall curve. You know, I mean, my guess is that an awful lot of black people would say they're not a hell of a lot better off than they were during Reconstruction.
Yeah,
I mean, quite honestly,
I bet you're wrong about that.
I've seen black scholars make that argument that things are actually worse. And again, it's not about, it's better in terms of not a separation of, you know, white and colored drinking fountains and things like that, but in terms of who's going to jail, who's getting lethal injections, who's getting electrocuted, who's, you know, I mean, all that sort of stuff.
I hear you.
That's not necessarily better for black people.
No, I used that as an example because you had mentioned factors.
Well, you asked me when do things go well,
yeah.
And what I was saying was we have to define the word well, because one could say that there was a great expansionist period from the late 16th century down to maybe 1870 or something like that. I mean, we could talk about that, but the question is how are we going to define the word success? You know, many years ago, great American historian Lewis Hartz wrote a book called The Liberal Tradition in America, in which he argued that there were certain societies that were fragment societies. That is to say, they took fragments of Europe and they made whole cultures out of them, whereas the European cultures were a lot more complex and a lot more rich. And he said the United States is a fragment society, and the fragment that it took was the British middle class in the 16th and 17th centuries, which was very aggressive and entrepreneurial. And so if that's a success, okay, you know, great economic expansion. By, let's say, 1876, the United States was producing 1/3 of the world's manufacturers. I mean, we'd have to agree that that's very impressive. But in a fragment society, you only emphasize one thing. And that's why I'm saying that our success has actually been a failure.
How much longer do we have to hang on?
Oh, yes, it's going to end at 2 p.m., August 4th, 2045. Everybody get ready, for the big crash.
All right. Well, that's disappointing.
2045 is not bad, actually. We got a while.
In 30 seconds or less, because we're out of time, are China and India the obvious choices? Do you ever look at that? Is there the societies that are the beginning of an empire that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that China is the likely contender. It's just that with some important modifications, I would say that China is the United States in Mandarin. It has the same social inequality, the same kind of oppression. It's no place I would want to live, but then I don't want to live in the United States, and I don't.
Morris, are you constantly depressed?
Oh, no, I wake up in the morning feeling great. People ask me that, and actually I'm not depressed at all. And the reason for that is it's really great to be pursuing the truth to the extent that you're able to. It's a great feeling. When I wake up in the morning, I breathe deeply and I say, hey, another day. So I want to say to you, Cenk, Teşekkür ederim.
Yeah, bir şey değil. Sağ ol. That was some nice Turkish that Morris Berman just broke out there for you. All right, the book is called Why America Failed, The Roots of Imperial Decline. Obviously, we just had an interesting conversation about it where we had some disagreements, but it's a fascinating thesis. And Morris, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on the show, Cenk.